First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, Professor Abbas Milani and Ms. Roma Parhat, for their efforts over the past year to arrange this event and bring us together. To their credit, when the corona pandemic made it impossible for the conference to be held in person, they did not give up. They continued to make the elaborate arrangements for the remote version of the conference that we're having. Like the rest of you, I'm sure, I would have much preferred the original format, but I think we're all trying to get used to this new normal. With regard to the overall focus of the conference on Shahrukh Meskoob's life and works, I must admit it has always been rather difficult for me to decide how best to characterize him as one of the leading Iranian intellectuals of his generation. He was, of course, an unusually gifted writer, or as he preferred to describe himself, essayist, and one of our most perceptive literary and cultural historians. But beyond these appellations, I believe he was also an unusually principled and independent-minded intellectual who, after a decade-long stint in the Tudeh party, never bent to the fashionable ideas and currents of his time, and was willing to reveal his own self-doubts and inner conflicts with utter honesty, as we can see, for example, in his 2-volume memoirs and reflections, Ruz Hadar Rah, a work that is perhaps unique in our literary history. A great deal has been written about Meskoob since his death a decade and a half ago. It's my hope that this conference would bring us closer to appreciating Shahrukh Meskoob's place in the 20th century Iran's literary and intellectual history. The focus of my own presentation today is quite limited. I will be talking about Meskoob's views on the Iranian cultural or national identity as these views evolved in the past 2 or 3 decades of his life. In presenting his outlook on this topic, I will be drawing mainly from his book Milliyat va Zaban, which was published in Paris in 1989 and subsequently translated by Michael Hillman as Iranian Identity and the Persian Language, and published in 1992. I will also be relying on his various talks and interviews on the subject, and my own interviews and conversations and rather extensive correspondence with him over a period of 3.5 decades of our friendship. As is well known, Meskoob viewed language as the main pillar of Iranian cultural identity, or what is more commonly described as Iranian national identity. Here, I should point out that in using the term nation or the adjective national, he was not referring to the inhabitants or citizens of a modern nation state with internationally recognized boundaries. He was well aware that the term nation in the contemporary usage of the term, could not be applied to Iran until the late 19th or early 20th century. What he had in mind could more accurately be labeled as هویت فرهنگی or cultural rather than national identity of Iranians, a sense, if you will, of Iranianness that has been shared collectively in most periods of Iran's long and turbulent history. Meskoob's emphasis on language as a pillar of Iranian cultural identity derived from the importance that he attached to the role of language in human consciousness, thought, and social existence more generally. He believed that the ability to express our thoughts and feelings in words and to relate to others primarily through the use of language was a uniquely human trait. If we are social animals, to use Aristotle's famous phrase, it is because we are able to engage with others, from close family members to distant members of our community, through the use of language. These interactions with others take place in a particular geographic location, that is, of course, before the modern means of communication and the internet. And as they continue over extended periods of time, by which he meant generations or centuries, they create not only emotional bonds and a sense of communal identity in the speakers or among the speakers, but also an attachment to the place where these interactions took place. In other words, the prevalence of a common language helps to create not only enduring social bonds and a sense of shared history, but also an emotional attachment to the place in which such bonds evolved over long periods of time. Language is also the principal vehicle by which a people can recall or reclaim their past, not only through recorded or imagined history, but also through their folklore, mythologies, literature, life stories, sacred texts, and ethics. Even those aspects of cultural tradition that are not, strictly speaking, dependent on language, such as works of art, architecture, music, cuisine, ways of adapting to the environment, and above all, our religious rituals and beliefs. These too are often transmitted with the aid of language. Even in our sacred relations with the realm of the divine, we rely mainly on language by uttering what we call words, du'as, zikrs, and saying daily prayers, namaz. Such religious utterances and prayers are often read or spoken in a language that may not be familiar or understandable by the believers who are uttering them. For example, the non-Arab speakers read the Quran or say their prayers in Arabic. This is also true, of course, in other religious traditions. For example, in reciting verses from the Avesta by Zoroastrians, for them, the meanings of these verses was completely unknown for centuries until the Avestan texts were deciphered and translated initially into one or two European languages and later into Persian and other languages. In the case of Iran, it is all too evident that our knowledge of much of our ancient history comes from the discovery of written tablets from the Achaemenid and earlier times. Our imagined and pre-Islamic epic history came from the various Shahnames, most notably, of course, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, to the study of which, as you all know, Meskoob devoted most of his life. And for much of our cultural history after the Islamic conquest, we rely on the works of our great poets like Hafez, Sa'di, Khayyam, Nizami, Rumi, as well as a more limited number of writings, prose writings, such as the Mirrors for Princes and the like. In much of this, poetry seems to be the main form of transmission, perhaps more so in the case of the Iranian culture than other world cultures. We seem to be more reliant on poetry than prose in recalling, in understanding, in capturing our past history. Meskoob was aware that in several periods of Iranian history, Persian, the language that he placed so much emphasis on, or more generally, even languages, did not serve as the basis for the Iranian cultural identity. In the Achaemenid period, for example, it was not language, but a sense of tribal or ethnic identity that served as the bond, if you will, to create and sustain group identity. In the Sasanian period, it was a combination of racial and religious identity. Racial in the sense of Iranian versus an-Iranian, non-Iranians, and the religious identity of Zoroastrianism. In the Safavid period, it was not language as the basis for our cultural or national identity, since most of the rulers of that period and their Qizilbash soldiers were Turkish speakers. But the basis for identity was the claims of Shi'i ancestry, and which served as a common and a core national or imperial identity during the Safavid period. In his book, Melliyat ve Zaman, Meskoob analyzes the role of three major social groups: the courtiers and bureaucratic officials, the religious scholars, and the Muslim mystics, the Sufis, in the spread and flourishing of Persian language in Iran and what has come to be called the Persianate world, roughly from the 10th to the end of the 19th century. He later argued that with the political and social changes that took place during and after the Constitutional Revolution, these groups lost their influence, their importance as guardians of the Persian language and identity, and they were replaced by a new social group in Iranian society, the secular intelligentsia, made up of writers, poets, and others, such as Nima Yushij, Hidayat, Tagizadeh, among many others. In closing, I want to emphasize the distinction that I've tried to draw between Meskoob's emphasis on Iranian cultural or national identity, hoviyet farhangi or hoviyet milli, on the one hand, and nationalist sentiments and ideologies. Nationalism refers to a political ideology that seeks to unite and mobilize a people, usually within the bounds of a contiguous territory or internationally recognized state, in their pursuit of sovereignty, self-determination, and perceived collective interests. The cultural strands that make up a people's cultural and national identity, the ones that Meskoob focused on, they tend to be more diffuse and politically dormant. To be turned into nationalist ideologies, they need to be stirred up, emotionally charged, and crafted in ways that could foster group loyalty and a proclivity towards political action. This is often achieved by identifying or creating near or distant others who can be blamed for not abiding by a nation's cherished values, by challenging its interests, or in the extreme, by threatening its security and survival. This was not what Meskoob had any interest in promoting, that is, the nationalist ideology. Neither did Meskoob view the Persian language as a basis or a tool for political dominance or exclusion. He believed, rather, that an Iranian national identity based or mediated by the Persian language does not belong to Persian speakers alone. His ideal, I believe, was an Iran in which Persian would serve as the official and the, if you will, the lingua franca, but one in which speakers of other languages, that is Turkish, Kurdish, Baluch, Arabic, etc., could be taught, could teach their own children in and speak their own language in their immediate communities, in their exchanges, but would communicate with their Persian speakers, Persian-speaking compatriots, and speakers of other tongues, indeed in Persian. This is what I believe he cherished as an ideal. I think I'd like to end my brief presentation here and look forward to the presentations by our very distinguished other speakers at the conference, and hopefully to a lively discussion with others in the audience. With all the best.